Okay, part two. So we're still talking about the 1920s, and we're talking about how the culture is changing in the 1920s. So we've talked about the flappers and the speakeasies and the Red Scare. So now we're talking about this idea of consumerism. So after World War One, the economy is kind of doing okay, right? We're making all these new products, and so we're going to start to see people buying a lot of things. And the reason why they're doing so much buying is because of several different things. So, one of them is the creation of this installment plan. So, this is the idea that you can pay in installments. So, let's say, like you can see this ad here, this is for a refrigerator. So, let's say you're going to buy a refrigerator, but you don't have enough money to pay for it all at one time. Well, they created this installment plan. So, what you're going to do instead is you're going to pay a little bit at a time, right? So, what was happening is you have a lot of people buying these things that maybe they couldn't afford all at one time. So, it's going to start to make people feel like, oh, I can buy these new like luxury items. We're also going to see an increase in advertising. So, a lot of people are going to be using things like the radio and newspapers to advertise their goods. And so, people are going to start to get this sense of like, I need to buy this thing. Like, I don't just want it, I need it. And we're also going to see a lot of mass production. So that means we're making a lot of these goods. And so there's more of them for people to buy. And so the price is going to go down. And so it makes it affordable to just your average people. You can see in this picture right here, it says buy today, pay later. This is when we start to see things like the credit system, not necessarily the credit card yet, but buying something on credit. So it's saying like, I don't have enough money to buy this right now, but I'm going to get it now anyways, and I'll pay for it later, which we're going to see is going to lead us to not good things later on. A really good example of this consumerism was the car. So, Henry Ford developed the first mass produced automobile, the Model T, which you've probably heard of, by using the assembly line. So, what he did is he came up with this new method of making the car that made it so much faster and so much cheaper to make. So, instead of one person making an entire car, he would have basically one person is making just the steering wheel. One person is making just the tires. One person is just making the seats in the car, right? So it goes down the line. And so the person only has to specialize on making that one part rather than making the entire car. So it's going to make this process go through a lot faster and a lot more efficiently. So it's going to speed up the production and drive down the cost. So for the first time, the car is going to be affordable to the middle class. So the car was invented before the 1920s, but the 1920s are when we're going to see it like really start to be more than just a luxury item. So before it was really only for the super wealthy. Think of it almost like having a private jet. So that was kind of the way the car was before the 1920s. But now it's going to make it to where all middle class people can afford them. It's going to start to really replace horses as the main modes of transportation. So we're going to get a lot of effects from that. We're going to start to see suburbs pop up. So you've got a suburb is like outside of a city. Right. And so people are going to live outside of the city and then drive their car to work in the city. People are going to start to do things like take vacations further away. You're going to start to see things like gas stations. We're going to need some improved roads. There's a whole, I mean, think about how much the car impacts our life now. Like how many things you couldn't do if you didn't have a vehicle at all. And so it really is going to change the face of America. And so again, it kind of plays into this consumerism, this idea that like, I need this thing. So moving on, another part of kind of consumerism is this idea of mass media. So we're going to start to see what we call pop culture, popular culture. So like radio, movies. The radio was the biggest form of entertainment at the time. They had music and sports and news all on the radio. And here's the thing is when you have everybody listening to the same radio stations, it's going to create this like unified culture just because everyone is seeing the same thing, right? Like they're all experiencing the same thing. So movies are the same way. People are going to start to movies would be like a date night, kind of like they are now. You would go out to the movies, and these movies are reflecting these changing attitudes towards fashion and lifestyle. So the flappers and things like that, the independence for women, it's going to reflect those. And so, again, that creates this more unified national culture because people are all going to be watching the same things, all going to be listening to the same things. And then the last thing we look at in Standard 16 is the Harlem Renaissance. So, the Harlem Renaissance was started in Harlem, New York. And basically, what you have is this wave of creativity from Blacks in Harlem, New York, that's going to create this whole art movement. So, the biggest part of that would be this new music style, jazz. So, jazz was this kind of blend of like the old slave hymns and like slave music with these new Western instrument styles. And so they combine these things together and create this whole new form of music. And it becomes an absolute huge thing in the culture of the 1920s to the point where it's actually kind of bringing the races together a little bit because the whites are listening to jazz as well. Like you can see down here, the jazz age, the 20s. You've got people like Louis Armstrong and Duke Ellington were really big jazz musicians. You're going to start to see new art movements, a whole bunch of literature. You've probably read Langston Hughes in one of your English classes at one point. So this like rhythmic poetry. So basically you have all of this new creativity all coming out of Harlem, New York. And that's why we call it the Harlem Renaissance. So that becomes a really big part of pop culture. So the 20s, super fun time. You've got, you do have the Red Scare, which is not so great. But you've got the speakeasies and the jazz music and the flappers, and you've got, people driving the new cars and listening to the radio, and just this really fun new things in American history. So, yeah, that's the end of Standard 16.